Good to have you.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Dave.
Morning.
Good to see you all. Today we're talking about governance with Dr. Chartier and his book, The Idea of an Adventist University. And I thought maybe Numbers 11 would be a fun chapter to read as we think about governance. Now, when the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. Then the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed them, some outlying parts of the camp. But the people cried to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire abated. So that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned against them. The rabble among them had a strong craving, and the Israelites also wept again and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its color was that of gum resin. The people went around and gathered it in mills or beat it in mortars, then boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell on the camp in the night, the manna would fall with it. Moses heard the people weeping throughout the families, all at the entrances of their tents. Then the Lord became very angry, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you treated your servant so badly? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth to them that you should say to me, 'Carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a suckling child to the land that you promised on oath to their ancestors?' Where am I to get meat to give these people? For they come weeping to me and say, 'Give us meat to eat.' I am not able to carry all this people alone, for they are too heavy for me. If this is the way you are going to treat me, put me to death at once, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my misery." So the Lord said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tent of meeting and have them take their place there with you. I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people along with you, so that you will not bear it all by yourself. And say to the people, 'Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wailed in the hearing of the Lord, saying, If only we had meat to eat. Surely it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not only 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until the meat comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, Why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, The people I am with number 600,000 on foot, and you say, I will give them meat, that they may eat for a whole month. Are there enough flocks and herds to slaughter for them? Are there enough fish in the sea to catch for them? Then the Lord said to Moses, Is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So Moses went out and told the people all the words of the Lord, and he gathered 70 elders of the people and placed them all around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and took some of the spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do so again. So let's pray. Dear God, there's a lot about this story that doesn't sound quite true to life. We don't think of the dew coming down out of heaven like the rain. We think maybe that number of 600,000 might a little bit be on the high side. We think it difficult to view divine judgment on the edges of the camp, but not the whole camp or none of the camp. All of this is sort of up in the air for us, but so many other ways it's true to life. There are always the rabble in every community, and the rest of the people are easily persuaded by them. So the rabble starts saying, we want some meat, and pretty soon all the people of Israel are clamoring for meat. And then they have very selective memories. They remember the cucumbers and the garlic and the fish they didn't have to pay for, but they don't remember the slavery. They don't remember the lash. They don't remember that the pharaohs were asking more and more from them with less and less material. And then surely we have all seen administrators at their wits' end saying, this burden is too heavy for me. Let me be free from it. But for me, the most interesting part of it is that on the one hand, the Lord says, I will come down to you. And on the other hand, the Lord says, I am in your midst. So somehow there's a very nearness, and somehow there's a very otherness to all of this. Help us today as we learn from Gary about governance in the university and perhaps elsewhere. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Over to Gary Chartier. Not everybody knows Gary, perhaps, and that is, so I'll say just a word about him. He is a son of Corona, California, from a family of a doctor, medical doctor, and a businesswoman, successful businesswoman. He went to La Sierra Academy. I don't now know if I met Gary when he was in academy or in college, but he went to college at La Sierra, then to Claremont, earned a PhD at Cambridge University, came back and earned a law degree at the UCLA School of Law, and has published how many books, Gary?
I don't know, Dave, too many.
He's being very modest, and many scholarly articles. And not too long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, he earned an academic degree that very few people earn at Cambridge University, called the Doctor of what?
It's a little confusing for reasons we don't need to get into here, but we can either say a Doctor of Law or Doctor of Laws. The abbreviation that everybody would be familiar with is LLD.
But it's not an honorary degree. It's a degree based on academic achievement. And I have forgotten how many people in the United States have received this degree.
A lot more have in England, I should say. But if you think about people with LLDs and then the equivalent degree from Oxford, which is the DCL, LLD from Cambridge or DCL from Oxford, at least if you look around American academia, I've been able to find about half a dozen.
Okay. So you're in that small group of half a dozen people who have been so honored. Thank you, Gary, for being not only a good academic, but a wonderful friend. That's the best thing about you, I think. Friendship means a lot to you. You like to have friends and you like to be a friend, and all of us benefit from that. So thank you very much. Now we are going to look at chapter 4, I think it is, on governance. Like always, I'll see if you want to say something first, or we'll jump right into it.
Before we do, David, you need to, I think, do the Zoom recording. I don't see that up there.
Well, I know I had to click yes, I agree, I'm being recorded. So
Yeah, that's the Facebook. There you go.
Thank you, Forrest. So here we are, starting off with Gary Chartier, and we are looking at chapter 4 on governance in the life of the university. And I just asked him if he had something he wanted to say before we get started, or should I jump in with some questions?
Sorry, I have to relocate here because I was sitting outside, but unfortunately there's a lawnmower going on that's not going to work well for recording.
Before I go further, Gary, do you want to say anything about the mishap or the unfortunate thing that has occurred to you? You put it on Facebook, so I guess it's not too private.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we were over in Redlands, and when we came back, it was on Sunday, when we came home, we found that our home had been ransacked, and it looks like 5 laptops and a monitor and an iPod and a couple of decorative swords and probably some other things I'm forgetting had been absconded with. We continue to look around to see if these are showing up for sale online. Haven't seen any evidence of that so far. Haven't heard anything from any of the local pawn shops, which we contacted. Haven't heard anything from the police, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that the actual market value of these items isn't very high. Their value is high to us, both because of the information on the laptops and, of course, because of the kind of historical value of some of the individual items that were stolen. But yeah, so that happened a couple of weeks ago. We're still kind of dealing with the aftermath of that.
Now, was all of that material backed up, or have you
No.
lost them?
Oh no, we've lost a fair amount of stuff.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Well, okay. As I indicated on Facebook, I think sometimes the loss is important, but the sense of having been invaded, to have one's privacy and even person invaded like that is a very distressful thing. Okay, back to governance. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, no, I mean, you just suggested I might kick off. So, one thing I guess I would say about this topic is that I first learned something useful about the issues that I discuss in this chapter from a text that I acknowledge somewhere in the book. I am happy to recognize it as very influential on my thinking. When I was a student at La Sierra, to my everlasting regret, I passed up a chance to join something called the Task Force on University Governance, which issued a report that the Board of Trustees voted in, I think it was August of 1985. And this was a report looking kind of systematically at governance across what were then the 2 campuses of Loma Linda University, offering both an overall kind of structure for individual decision-making bodies, a structure for information flow and decision-making flow among those bodies, and then a kind of overall philosophy of governance. And, I've returned many times to that board-voted task force report and have drawn with real appreciation on the suggestions offered there at the beginning, focusing on a whole range of complementary concerns that rightly, I think, feed into our thinking about institutional governance. Again, we've got a whole range of different concerns that I think ought to be taken into account here. And so this is what I try to do in the chapter, that, we're thinking about, issues of how we treat individual people well, but we're also thinking about questions of how institutions can function most effectively. And I try to be concerned with, with both of those kinds of issues. Also, where students are concerned, there's the further thought of education as a dynamic here. So governance at a university, it seems to me, builds on a whole range of factors, a whole range of considerations and concerns. And I thought these were very aptly addressed in that task force report from so many years ago.
Well, thank you very much. I think also I need to acknowledge some sensitivity on this issue that might uh, cloud my good judgment, because I personally think that one of the factors that led to the divorce between the Loma Linda and the La Sierra campuses, I want to say one of the factors, was uh, a sense that the Senate on the La Sierra campus had moved quite swiftly and inadvisedly on some matters. And
Dave, can I just say the Senate was a cross-campus body?
well, right.
It happened that the chair of the Senate during the decisive year was a member of the La Sierra faculty, but the Senate was established by the university-wide faculty handbook and included people from all schools of the university.
Well, thank you for that clarification, because you're right. I traveled from Loma Linda to La Sierra for Senate meetings, so you're right. But there was some sensitivity there about what was going on, and there was some sense that the faculty senate was the tail that was trying to wag the dog, not the doll, but the dog. And I got into that because I was not in favor of the campuses going their separate ways, and I was vocal about that. And not everybody appreciated what I had to say about that. Some people thought I was being disloyal to Loma Linda. I didn't think it in those terms, but I did think that the School of Religion would suffer by virtue of the divorce, and we have. I'm not sure that other entities of the former university have suffered, but the School of Religion has never been what it used to be since this division of the campus has occurred. So we have experienced a loss, and I don't think that's contestable. On the other hand, on balance, I think I was wrong. I think that La Sierra has flourished much more fully than it would have had the change not occurred. And so I think that though I still regret the impact of this change on the School of Religion, now two schools of religion, or at La Sierra, the HMS Richards Divinity School. I think in general, it has been good for La Sierra to be free to develop its own identity and its own future, and it has been very, very creative in doing so. But there is that sensitivity on my part. Do you want to say anything more about that history?
Sure. It was a challenging and complex period, right? And so there are a number of people here who lived through that along with us, I'm sure, and have their own thoughtful and informed perspectives that I certainly don't want to trump. I mean, at the time, that everything really kind of, began to develop in the fall of 1986 when then President Norman Woods announced his plan to consolidate all university operations in Loma Linda. I think I was scared about what seemed to me the risk that, in various ways, the La Sierra programs would end up being shortchanged. And I was quite protective of those programs. That I think, whether the stance there, because of course the ultimate split, it seems to me clearly is a reverberation from the debate that happened over the proposal to consolidate. As I look back on that now and I think about the various options in front of us, I think there certainly are advantages to not being directly under the scrutiny of the General Conference, and that's not something I envy my friends at Loma Linda with regard to it all. But apart from that, it's much harder for me to know what the right way to proceed was than I thought I perhaps knew then, and I certainly miss having the kind of institutional connection with colleagues at Loma Linda that we had in that period. I don't have anything very profound to say. I mean, it's, it was a big, complex a cluster of issues that were on the table by the time the divorce actually happened. But that marriage, I think, could have succeeded, and whether it should have, I guess, a question we can keep talking about. But I appreciate your putting it on the table, Dave.
Yeah. Now, one of the consequences of that was that each campus had to develop its own senate or the equivalent. And what emerged at Loma Linda, with encouragement from me and others, was not a senate, but what we called then, and still do, I think, the Interfaculty Advisory Council, or IFAC. And this has simply the role of listening to and responding to administrative initiatives, but it has no administrative power at all. It is wholly advisory. And I think that has become a matter of some frustration for some people. But okay, Judy says it changed from IFAC to University Faculty Council a number of years ago. Okay, Judy, let me ask you: has the Senate become, or what did she call it, University Faculty Council? Has it become more independent than it was previously? Is it able to act? Does it have the power to act as well as the power to advise?
Well, Dave, I haven't been a member the last 3 years, but I was for many years before that. I would say we have similar struggles. What would you say, Ellen? Ellen
That's
DeRico.
tension, isn't it? I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, I was asking Ellen DeRico because she's also been a part of it.
Yeah, no, we're advisory only. We have no decision-making power or authority at all.
Well, it was interesting to me to read the WASC. We're going to get back to Gary's book in just a second, but it was interesting to me to read the WASC report, which resulted in 10 years of accreditation for Loma Linda, which is the highest amount of accreditation it can receive. And when it came to shared governance, WASC said that the faculty at Loma Linda are very pleased with this way of doing things. And that, I was a little surprised by that. I myself favored, and I think I still do, an advisory council rather than a decision-making council. But I didn't know that there was that much uniformity and joy about it all. So that was just an interesting thing. Monty raised his hand, I think.
Yes, I did. I'm a current member of UFC, have been for several years. And I think one of the things that I've noticed this at Loma Linda as well as PUC is challenge or lack of experience of how to have influence in an institution. And this, well, I don't know how you were raised or others in this group were raised, but I was raised to be very suspicious of unions. And so this idea of pulling together as a group to have an influence and using that influence, I sometimes see that hesitancy in UFC, but I think that's what we have. And I don't know how tuned in you are to it, Dave, but last year, Human Resources came out with a new appraisal process for faculty and staff. And some of us were not as happy with that and didn't feel like we had as much of an advisory role as we should have on that. And so we're working on that. And so again, this I think is very pertinent to what Gary, I think, will be talking about today. And that is that there are decision makers, but then there's also shared ideas of shared governance, and what does it mean to share governance? And does that mean that you just show up to a meeting to tell someone that something's being done, or are they actively involved and sincerely involved in the process, and their feedback is taken in? And that's I think one thing that UFC is working on right now with this faculty appraisal process. Should faculty have a say in how they are appraised? And so that's the discussion we're having right now. And our thought is that in the affirmative of that, we should absolutely have a say. But then the question is, well, what influence do we have? And I would say that if we pull together, we have a lot of influence. But it takes people coalescing and being willing to put aside small differences in order to focus on the big differences, but then pull together. And at Loma Linda, that would be things like having UFC agree, having deans come together, and between deans and UFC, you can have influence on policy, I think. But there's a hesitancy to pull together that way, I think, and maybe even more so, extra so in Adventist institutions because of our suspicions of unions.
Well, that's very helpful. I sort of feel like someone who pushed the boat off the dock and lost track of what happened to it. And it sounds like it's been moving in basically the same direction and has many of the opportunities, because I think having a voice and having an opportunity to be heard by the administration is a very, very important thing. But on the other hand, not having a vote is, I understand it to be a matter of frustration. And then without getting into too very risky proposition to raise one's voice, somebody said here, I think that's so, although I've done a bit of it over the years, and I suppose I've paid a price for that. On this particular issue though, Monty, I hope the UFC, do I have that correct? University Faculty Council, is that right?
Yes.
I hope that it is actively involved in this issue of faculty appraisal. And I don't want to get into it too much because we want to focus on more general things and get back to Gary's book. But it does seem to me that at this point, human resources is coming to the academy with a corporate model of business management, and that it doesn't always fit comfortably on an academic campus. And I really think that that needs to be addressed. And I think there are many benefits of treating things in the academy as though it were a business, but there are some drawbacks. Now, let's be clear that Loma Linda hires more than 15,000 people, right? I don't know how many more than 15,000 people, quite a few more than 15,000 people. And the idea of shared governance becomes a challenge because many of those people are not, I would say probably 95% of those people are not academics, but they're clinicians and administrators and business people, and they have a different ethos. So I do worry, and I have expressed my views to human resources about this. I feel like the university needs to be very careful that it doesn't lose its character as a university as it takes on some of these more business-like matters. Now, if anybody else wants to talk about this, I'm happy to do so. But maybe we'll get back to Gary's book here just a little bit. What does it say? Very risky proposition to raise one's voice. I don't see anything else here. Maybe a way back. Well, let me first ask, does anybody else want to address the specific situation at Loma Linda? Okay, let's circle back to Gary's book if we can. And maybe we can ease into it, sort of drawing a line between what we've been talking about and what Gary's book is about. And maybe, Gary, maybe you could tell us what a form the faculty consultation group has taken At La Sierra, we've heard some about what's happened at Loma Linda. What's happened at La Sierra?
Yeah, I mean, look, my own involvement there in recent years has been more limited, and so I can't comment on all the specifics right now. I'll pass on that, but I think one thing I would say is that what I try to do in chapter 4 of this book, in talking about governance, really in important ways builds. So I talked about the report of the Task Force on University Governance, which was a joint campus business activity, but also to build on a more general philosophy that it seems to me God articulated and embraced, in the late 1970s and early 80s for the two campus university, reflecting on a little influence, I think, from our friend Charles Teal. Dave and I saw each other at Marta Teal's memorial service yesterday, and Charles is certainly on my mind. And this was an attempt to articulate university-wide, and it seems to me this was generally embraced at the time, was an idea that we're going to distinguish between two kinds of things: policy and administration. And administration is the responsibility of administration, policy the responsibility of the faculty. And so that was there was a clear distinction. Faculty members aren't trying to second guess operational decisions, aren't kind of involved in those day-to-day matters, but are staying, as it were, at the if not 40,000 foot level, maybe the 20,000 foot level, and kind of thinking about general frameworks for operation, which are then implemented through administrative committees and, of course, full-time administrators. I should say that while I carry the title associate dean, I often feel like suggesting that I'm really an administrator is a bit of a joke. There are people here. Dave certainly has managed a much bigger budget than I ever have at the Ethics Center, and of course, Brian's done a tremendous amount of leadership at Loma Linda, and so I'm an amateur observer from the outside, I sometimes think, but anyway.
Well, the Center for Christian Bioethics budget is very, 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 very small. It's hard for me to imagine anybody small. Although I will say that it's remarkable that center has lasted. This contrast. Go ahead, Monty. Apparently not. Let's.
I didn't hear what you. If you asked the question, Dave, I didn't hear it. You're, at least for me, you're cutting in and out.
And in your chapter, I am. Am I cutting in and out?
Yes, you are, David.
Yes, you're cutting in and out.
Certainly for me. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let me try again. Let's back to Oxford University and Cambridge University. Am I being heard now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. He begins his chapter with to those two schools, one of which he studied at, and how those schools organize their lives. Could you say something about that, Gary?
Sure. So I hope that people can hear me. Dave is definitely cutting out for me, and I want to make sure that's not a problem on my end. If it is, I do apologize.
I can hear you well. Gary.
Okay, great, Forrest. Thank you very much. So, so I'm not suggesting in the chapter or anywhere else that Oxford and Cambridge can be directly modeled by any other institution, because they have their own quite distinctive histories that have developed over many years that have shaped their organizational patterns, and they've both undergone pretty significant university-wide transitions organizationally in the past 2 decades. But it's just worth noting as kind of one extreme.
Oh yeah, no, I know. I saw that when I drove by. Beautiful.
I'm sorry.
One second, that somebody
I
needs
got that,
to,
I got that taken care of.
okay. On your
Yeah.
way, Gary. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, both institutions are made up of 30, each institution is made up of 30 odd constituent colleges. And and the colleges are not, as in the US setting, you might think, they're not degree granting institutions like freestanding colleges, but they're also not institutions responsible for the delivery of whole curricula. You might go to a university and encounter the College of Medicine there, for instance. That's not the model. The colleges are, however, the places where students and many members of the faculty live, literally, and eat and socialize. And so you have 30 odd independent colleges, and then you separately have the university, which is home to the various academic departments. And a typical faculty member will live in both an academic department and a college. At the university department, engaged in lecturing and the hiring of senior people there. At the college level, involved in providing small group instruction and so forth. But what's interesting, so again, things get a bit more complicated in recent decades, and I want to just pass on that as regards the university level structure, but the college structures remain the same. Each of the colleges is an independent corporation, and it's chartered by Parliament. It has a special royal charter, and it is it's a corporation that is often characterized as something like, the full name might be the president and fellows of Larson College, and the way this would work, you've got it really becomes a kind of self-renewing corporation with the fellows, who are in general as we would say, the members of the academic staff, and then the president or master or provost or whatever, different labels at different institutes, different colleges, is selected by the fellows, and the fellows themselves fill vacancies in the in their own number. And so you really have a kind of self-renewing corporation. And then the model, until fairly recently, was pretty clearly that governance at the university level was in turn kind of built on the backs of the colleges. And that so that, for instance, when somebody was the vice chancellor of the university, which in UK Commonwealth institutions, the vice chancellor is the actual operational head of the institution. The chancellor is a ceremonial position. The vice chancellor at Oxford and Cambridge was somebody who was the head of one of the colleges, and so they were just kind of rotated around among those. So the bottom line was, it's a model that has been traditionally, things have changed a lot because of outside funding now, as you might guess, but it's been traditionally the case that's very much built on self-governance, and that's the reason I mentioned it.
One technical question, then a larger question. Are the academic departments in the university drawn from faculty from each of the colleges?
So the academic departments are, they're functionally separate from the colleges. And in principle, somebody might be a member of an academic department or faculty and not a member of a college fellowship, or vice versa. So many people are both. I think it would clearly be the norm to be both, but there are various reasons why somebody might not be in one way or another.
Okay, so let me back up then and ask the larger question. What can Adventist higher education learn from this Oxbridge model, as you abbreviate the terms?
Yeah. I suppose we could say Camford, but for whatever reason, Oxbridge has just become the preferred abbreviation. So I guess what I think, one might learn there is just that this is I think a fairly interesting exercise and a fairly interesting experiment in a very kind of complex distributed model of governance that certainly includes a lot of, you might not exactly want to say grassroots or bottom up, but definitely you've got a lot of independent centers of power. I guess that's the way I would put it, that the individual colleges are centers of power. The departments probably are to a lesser extent, but to some extent. And then and other entities that are floating around in the university, like libraries and museums and so forth. And then but certainly the colleges really are the hard core of these separate centers of power, because they really do have separate legal status. And then just looking at the way in which they're able to function on an ongoing basis as self-renewing corporations, governed by their fellows who are in general the members of academic staff. Now, again, I don't try to argue that because that happens at Oxbridge, therefore that's what we ought to do. I simply offer it as a kind of throwaway example at the beginning of the chapter to highlight the fact that this has not certainly led to, chaos and people marrying pigs in the streets and so forth. It really has been a fairly viable arrangement over a pretty extended period. What I try to do in this chapter, however, is mainly to give substantive arguments for a shared participatory governance model, drawing on a range of complementary and I hope mutually reinforcing factors.
I followed you too. You said a range of complementary,
mutually reinforcing factors.
Okay, let's talk about those. What would be some complementary reinforcing factors?
So let's start out with a consideration that I think is especially important in this regard, which doesn't apply at all just to universities. It's an issue with regard to organizations of all kinds, both nonprofit and for-profit organizations. And this is the idea of information flow, right? That when decision making is centralized at the top of an organization, one consequence, it seems to me, is that the information that is distributed throughout the organization can often be can often get lost, right? That there's impedance, if you will, as that information is supposed to flow upward for people to use it to make decisions. So that the more hierarchically organized an organization, the more challenges I think there are with respect to getting information and making use of it. Whereas if you can empower people at quote the front lines to make decisions as much as possible, they can make more effective use of the information they've actually got available to them. So I think that's one kind of concern that I note. Not concern, one kind of consideration that I note, favoring, therefore, I think a more distributed and participatory model than one might otherwise have. Then, of course, there's just the distinctive expertise with respect to some, not all issues that professionals in a university setting have, not only the academic professionals, but professionals in a variety of other areas. I also focus on, a kind of general management point that when people are involved and able to participate in therefore own decisions, they're likely to be more supportive of the institution and more invested in it. I think respecting people's ideas and learning from them is a way of treating them with respect. And we might think there was a golden rule argument there. And then I also suggest that students, all these other considerations I think are relevant to student involvement. We also, of course, have to think about the way in which student feedback is important if we want to keep attracting and retaining the right students, and also the way in which participation can be a learning exercise, a learning opportunity for students. So for everybody, I think keeping people invested, helping the institution to learn, ensuring that information is used where it's possessed, treating people with fairness and respect. All of those militate, I think, in favor of participatory models. And then where students are concerned, there are the extra issues as regards, as it were, customer satisfaction and certainly also learning.
Well, it seemed to me that the two themes that kept recurring in the chapter were decentralization, as much decentralization as possible, and as much participation as possible. But then you do talk about as much, these are words I think from the chapter, as much latitude as possible, the faculty and others should have some part to play. They should have substantial influence. None of these is an unqualified gesture toward any group in the university to have unilateral discretion. And so my question is, what, not in particular, but what kinds of factors might limit the degree of decentralization there ought to be and the degree of participation there ought to be? I ask this because I was looking at the reports of a very progressive company, and the people were reporting on it, and they said, you know, here the decision-making process is too flat, which means we can never make a decision because there's no one really in charge, and we need a little more hierarchical structure in this particular business. So, what kinds of things would limit, let's say, the faculty in what it should have discretion over?
Yeah, I mean, look, we can, we can certainly go back and forth on that. My own view is that you have to read, as it were, chapter 4 and chapter 5 of this book together. I think the difficulty that we have institutionally in addressing the kind of concern you've just raised is very often, I think, something like the following. You risk running into the following problem, that members of the faculty are trained to be, are acculturated to be, are actively encouraged to be dreamers, and to come up with great ideas and to imagine what it might look like to put those ideas into action, and to welcome the opportunity, I think, to encourage other people to do that. However, what we often find is that those decisions or recommendations, or wherever they fall on the spectrum between those two things, can be made without full awareness of costs. And so I think what, so we have a situation in which, we have an administration which has to scramble to find resources to do things. There always are more demands on those resources than there are resources to expend. And administrators then find themselves with limited resources and demands from various constituencies on campus that various things happen. And obviously that can be crazy making. And there can be probably a lack of realism that some of us can exhibit when we're not actually confronted in a serious way with currently available resources and with the impact of decisions we might make on either acquiring or losing resources. And I think that's super important. So my own instinct is to say, I want to see a great deal of participation, a great deal of decentralization, but I want to find ways, and obviously this has to vary with the size of the institution and the particular ways in which it generates revenue and so forth, but I want to see those linked with enough financial responsibility for the units making decisions that there's accountability that's built into that process, rather than a kind of pie in the sky dreaming that allows decisions to be made, but responsibility palmed off elsewhere. So I think that's probably what I would be inclined to say there.
Okay, so one limiting factor would be resources, and a particular segment of the university may not have a clear picture. Resources are. I would think that one way to handle that would be to make the resources of the university more widely understood.
Yeah.
And that is another way of increasing, and you're going to say something.
No, I think making resources understood is hugely important. I'm going to put something else in the links here put another link here in the chat just to highlight what you've said. I think you're exactly right. So I'm interested in participation, more broadly, but I do want to call people's attention to this great book from the 90s, which I've used as a text intermittently when I've taught courses in various things related to governance, a book called Open Book Management. This is a book from a corporate context, but clearly applicable elsewhere, just saying, look, make as much information available as possible. And in so doing, you bring people on board to a significant extent.
Okay. Bob Ford has asked whether we can have a truly participatory campus if the campus is part of a church culture that is very hierarchical. And I'd like to get to that in just a moment. But I think the big question I have is, how does one keep a university, an Adventist university, genuinely Adventist? Parenthetically, I do agree with you that this chapter and the next one go together. And your so-called responsibility model in the next one is really, really pertinent here. But how would you go about making sure, as sure as possible, that La Sierra University or Loma Linda University or Andrews University, whatever, 100 years from now is genuinely an Adventist university?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything magic to say there, because we know that institutions change in various ways, and of course, church communities change in various ways, right? So you can imagine, for instance, a particularly unpleasant outcome, but one in which you have a church community that decides that it has no place for higher education. And the church administration decides that that's just not a constructive use of its resources, and really doesn't want to be involved there anymore. That creates a very different way of thinking about this, a different context for thinking about this, than one in which you have a church community and church administration that welcome higher education, but perhaps for some reason you have recalcitrant, higher education types. So a lot depends, I think, on just what that relationship looks like. And I think you can talk about what it is for the institution to be a certain way without knowing more about the relationship. My own view is that, as we talked about earlier in connection with, with academic freedom, I think it's really important to recognize the university as a contributor to the enhancement of the life of the church, and a contributor in virtue of its, role in stimulating dialogue and being part of an ongoing conversation, rather than assuming that we know in advance what the church's own identity is or what the institution's own identity is. None of that answers your question, and I don't have a good answer to the question, because I don't know how to guarantee identity in a particular way over time. I mean, because you can imagine certain kinds of so think about the institutional dynamics. Notre Dame is as obviously a Catholic institution as any institution in North America might be, and yet we know that the Fathers of the Holy Cross quite deliberately voted themselves out of office in the early 70s and replaced their governance of Notre Dame with a self-renewing board. Notre Dame has not somehow become an institution that people don't think of as thoroughly Catholic because of that, but that's got to be a question not of governance structure, but of culture. And I don't know what ultimately is serving to maintain that culture. I'm not an expert on Notre Dame.
But it hasn't lost its Catholic character. Although in the Catholic universities, I don't think it would be on the right end of the continuum. Maybe Catholic University of America is, and maybe Georgetown is even less so than Notre Dame. But yes, it has a.
Yeah.
Now, one thing Bob Ford just mentioned, that is many institutions have divorced themselves from their church bodies. I think that's true. However, if one studies the history of this, it's quite often the fact that the churches cut themselves off from the universities. They no longer feel like the university needs them. It's almost as though the church gives birth to the university grows up, and the church cuts it free. That happens again and again. And so it's not always the fact that the university cuts itself off from the church, but it's quite often the fact that the church cuts itself off from the university and says, you know, you're grown up now. You can go on your own. You don't need to rely on us financially and so forth. So it's a delicate thing. I have wondered what I would do if I were worried about the theological integrity of the church. I think what I would do is require all the theologians to get together once a year or once every other year and talk with each other, and let no one group of theologians move off on its own without being in conversation with the others. We have seen that. We have seen some theologians make great movements in the denomination and have hardly any interaction with the Adventist professional societies. And I think that that's too bad. I think the Adventist academic people can nudge against each other in ways that keep the community faithful if they are there. But if people absent themselves from those professional meetings, I do think we're in big peril. Okay, let's see, where do we go from here? I have,
David, can I mention?
I would like to move into the church a little bit, but Forrest was going to comment on something, I think.
Yes, I was. I was just going to draw a comment or focus on two Baptist universities in our area. One is Redlands University, which was Baptist. It's still technically Baptist, but they don't pretend to be a religious institution anymore, although they do have chapels. And then we have Cal Baptist University, which is still trying to keep its Baptistness, if that's a word. So we see right in here our own area, institutions that are struggling with those issues of what do we want to keep? And so it's a very real issue for these institutions.
Right, and because they are Baptist universities and come from a congregational model of church organization, the University of Redlands does what it finds best, and Cal Baptist University does what it finds best, and that works easier, I think, within their polity than it might in some other polity. Let me see if there's someone else here on the chat that wants to get in here. Okay. I'm wanting to get into the relationship between the structure of the church and the structure of the universities, but I wonder if we should take a break first. When Bob mentioned the church as being hierarchically structured, I think it's true in a way, but let's watch it. Look at this. The members of the congregation elect the leaders of the congregation. The congregations elect the leaders of the conference. The conferences elect the leaders of the union conferences. So it's bottom up that far. One would think that the union conferences would elect the division officers, but that's not so. What happens is that the general conference as a whole appoints the division officers, and that's because the divisions are not really a separate level of administration within the Adventist church. They are called divisions because they are segments, parts of the general conference. Technically speaking, we should not have a president of the North American division. We should stick with the language we used to have, and that is vice president of the general conference for the North American division. But I think as we move forward, we're seeing increasingly the divisions becoming more independent, and I think that we will make a big step forward if we make the division leadership accountable to the union leadership and the general conference leadership accountable to the division leadership, so that we have a continuous flow upward, but it's at that division union conference level that the downward flow information and the upward flow information, and not only information, power gets sort of bumping up against each other. I think Gary was going to say something.
Oh, just two things very quickly. First of all, when we talk about the relationship with the church, I do think it's super important to distinguish between relationship between a particular organizational structure and the relationship with the community. And thus, I think, again, the example of Notre Dame seems to me important, that, you know, you can have what appears to be a lively relationship with the Catholic Church, despite a distinction from the church's administrative structure. That's number one. Number two, with respect to the Adventist Church, while of course it's right that there's this upward flow that you've highlighted, I did just want to emphasize the obvious point that a big part of actual decision making in conferences and unions is going to be the work of pastors who are not picked by the congregations, but are instead, you know, selected by the unions, even if sometimes with influence from the congregations.
You're talking about particular pastoral assignments.
But I'm saying in other words, the voting power in, say, a conference constituency meeting is, is exercised to a significant degree by pastors who have themselves been picked by the conference rather than by the, rather than by the congregations. That's all I'm suggesting.
Yeah. Well, I think I might respond two ways. One is that congregations are increasingly having a say as to whom their pastors will be. And secondly, I have seen constituencies vote out conference and over the objections of the
Sorry, Jay, can't hear you. It's just
You're breaking up pretty badly.
We changed internet servicers and it's not working out. All right, so let's take a break.
Actually, we didn't change services. We got a new modem and it's causing problems.
Okay, well anyway, we're having problems. Maybe I should hand this over to Forrest now after the break, as we typically do anyway. And I think Forrest's connection is better than ours. So let's take a break and come back in 10 minutes. And I do think the structure of the church and the structure of the university overlap in important ways. Now, I was talking to an administrator, not at Loma Linda, but from another big Adventist medical center complex. And he said, let's be clear, we are hierarchical in our administration. And let's not pretend otherwise. That's the way it has to be in the medical center, and that's the way it will be. But I'm sure at each level of that hierarchy, there is participatory information too. Sorry to be inaccurate, but okay. We're talking about who is running the constituency meetings. Okay, let's take a break and then come back to this, because I think the church's role and the university's role, they're like a Venn diagram. They overlap, and the medical community has become more independent of the denomination, and I know that some people think the academic community should become more like the medical community in its more independence. Okay, let's take a break and be back in about 10 minutes.
And if you have a question, just raise your hand either electronically or wave it, and I'll put together a queue. McKinley, you're behind on your payments to me, so we're gonna have to work something.
Hi, Forrest. I was going to say, I'm going to just wave my can here, and that should attract your attention. Thank you.
So, raise your hand. I'll be watching for you.
Yeah. You can put me on the list. I have a question for
Okay.
Dr. Chartier.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bronwyn, David going to be back?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'd like to make one comment and then move on, and that is, I'd like to comment further, particularly for those who may be still involved in Loma Linda in ways that I'm not, and that is this business of a corporate model of decision-making with regard to personnel related to an academic community can be mischievous. I am not faulting the corporate model for what it does. I think it is necessary, it works, but the academic community is a different kind of community. The human resources area invited us to take a course, online course, and so I did, and then there's a quiz at the end of it, and I took the quiz. It didn't take me long to discover that almost always, not always, but almost always, the right answer was take your problem to human resources. And I just knew that that was the answer. You know, if I said that, I get at least 8% right on the test. So I just kept putting that in, take it to human resources, take it to human resources. And I did all right. Now, compare that. What happened to us is that when people step on each other's toes, and that happened in this Sabbath school a few weeks ago, people inadvertently step on each other's toes. And the best way, I think, to handle that is within the community itself, and not go running to human resources on all of those matters unless it's absolutely necessary. Our faculty in the School of Religion met, still does, 2 hours every week. I went to faculty meetings for 2 hours every week for 46 years. That means we had ways of discussing things and dealing with these issues as they inevitably come up without having to run to human resources for all of these matters. And I think it was mischievous when members of our faculty, instead of working things out in our own community of scholars, they went to human resources right away. And then that created tension. I am not faulting the corporate model. I'm just saying the corporate model is to be used in corporations, and a more academic collegial approach is to be used in the academy. And I surely hope the University Faculty Council, as I understand it is now named, will be heard on this matter and heard with a kind of clarity. I don't think that there's any reluctance on the part of Ron Carter or President Hart to hear these sorts of things. I know they're not, because I have myself expressed my concerns to both of them. So they're willing to listen. They may not always do what I want them to do. That's right. They're the deciders, I'm the advisors, but still they're willing to listen. But that's just a case study of how governance needs to be more subtle than it sometimes is. Okay, that's enough for me. Over to Forrest.
Okay, by the way, talk about going to HR in the military. They have it say, go see the chaplain, and he or she will punch your TS card. So anyway, same type of thing. Okay, we've got, Robert Ford, did you get your question handled or your comment handled? I guess so. I want to go to, let's see, McKinley. I see you waving your hand. Go ahead, McKinley.
Okay, thank you, Forrest, and thank you, Dr. Chartier, for your presentation. I've got two questions. First one, in the earlier discussion on the participatory nature of departments in university governance, resource availability or constraint appear to be suggested to make a difference. I wonder how might participation change if budgetary resources were not a constraint for a department?
So, and what's the second question?
Oh, you want me to? All right, the second question. It's a little different. The second question, I wonder if I can get you to think outside of the confines of your book but sort of iteratively or by application. How might a private university system that aspires to an Adventist character or culture, but is not officially tied to the church, assure such an outcome?
Okay, thank you for two articulate and thoughtful questions. I see, by the way, when we started, I didn't notice Dick Osborne's presence. So yet a further example of somebody here who has far more experience than I do managing these kinds of issues, and from whom we certainly all ought to be happy to learn. Yeah, so when I see people like Dick and Brian here, I hesitate to pop off at the risk of just making a fool of myself. But in any case, yeah, thank you for your articulate questions, McKinley. So how would decision making change if resources weren't an issue? I mean, I'm not, maybe I don't understand the question, but on the face of it, it seems like the conflicts are almost entirely over resources that we encounter. And so if if every department knew that it had access to an unlimited pool of resources, then it seems as if everybody's pet project could be funded. All the students everybody wanted to bring in could be brought in. All the research projects could be supported, and it's not clear why we'd have very much to argue about. In general, these are the arguments we have unavoidably reflect the fact that we've got finite resources, and we don't always think we have rational ways of divvying those up. So before I go on to the second question, McKinley, I feel like maybe I've misunderstood what your question was designed to elicit. So can you say just a little more about that?
Yes, let me perhaps clarify a bit. So Dr. Larson had mentioned that sometimes he spoke up and may have felt a penalty as a result of speaking up. Is it possible that if a department head were concerned about his resources being curtailed because he spoke up, would that, affect his participation level or willingness to speak up?
Oh, the answer to that surely is yes, right? I mean, I think that's simple. I think we all know that if we believe that finite institutional resources will be denied us or redirected, to perhaps positively removed, if we say things that are unpopular. If the distribution of resources is ultimately a discretionary matter, then I think that's of course going to inhibit conversation. Of course, that seems right. So just to say a bit more, so I think you highlight a question, highlight a topic that's near and dear to my heart, McKinley, with your second question about how a private institution that wanted to be Adventist, but that wasn't institutionally affiliated with the Adventist Church, what might it do to make that happen? And again, I offer the obvious example in the U.S. context of Notre Dame, which it seems to me is a thoroughly Catholic institution that nonetheless is not kind of affiliated institutionally in the way that, for instance, I think Dave's right about this, Catholic University of America is. That's an institution that's really managed by the Catholic hierarchy in North America. So of course we have, as we know, examples, right, that exist in the Adventist context. We have places like Weimar and Heartland that are higher educational institutions that identify themselves as Adventists, that are clearly taken to be Adventist by their constituents, by their students, by their employees, by those who fund them, and yet that certainly are not institutionally affiliated with the Adventist Church. So I don't obviously, want to encourage Loma Linda or anywhere else to emulate those institutions in all respects at the level of the specifics. But I guess what I would say is you can absolutely have an institutional culture that is such that those participants in that culture care about, want to invest in, want to support the growth of the Adventist family of faith. I don't think, so if I were So suppose I were the president of that kind of institution, what would I do? I'd certainly want to invite people not to have all the same views, but to care about the conversation and care about supporting the community. And I'd really want to know from people, not were they going to sign off on my preferred set of doctrinal distinctives, but were they prepared to care about in some tangible ways their contribution to the Adventist community. I'd want to nurture involvement in that community, certainly through worship, through small group activities on campus, but also through conversations among colleagues about how their various disciplines could be integrated with Adventist faith in various ways. And I'd want to encourage departments to be self-conscious about that as regards their teaching, their research, and their co-curricular activities. I don't think any of it can be guaranteed, but if you want to do that kind of thing, it's a matter of inviting into the conversation people who care enough to be deliberate and self-conscious about what they're doing.
Thank you very much. I wish the pandemic will end soon, and that way I can have a chance to perhaps sit down with you and go over these ideas a little bit more. I have a project that I'm working on that I can share with you.
I would be pleased to talk more.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, McKinley. I will now go to Dick Osborne. Dick?
Well, it's an interesting discussion, Gary, because I just spent 2 full days at Loma Linda University Health Board this week. Brian, great report to the board on your research project. The total amount of time that was spent on university business at that 8-hour board meeting on Tuesday was 15 minutes. It was focused on the hospital because, this is a unified system now. And the university, of course, with the new hospital construction and the financial challenges of COVID has really consumed their time. There was 15 minutes from Ron Carter, maybe another 15 minutes from Rod Neal reporting on the investment results, which are very important because Loma Linda has over a $1 billion investment, and it's a key part of probably 1.2 or 3 billion, key part of their income. First, I wanted to thank you for the book, and I hope it gets wide circulation because few people are thinking at this level about what it means to be a university. And of course, many of us are familiar with the earlier book by Fowler with a similar title. And so this is a great contribution. I don't know if there's a way to get this circulated broadly among the 13 Adventist campuses, but it certainly should be. There's so many places I could go. But since we've been on Notre Dame, I'll go there for a minute and then come back to what the topic was, governance. When I was at the North American Division, I was co-chair of a group called Denominational Executives in Church-Related Higher Ed, which were the 40 heads of church systems. I mean, everybody from Presbyterians to 2 Catholic organizations, Jesuit, Methodist, the whole range. And we decided to invite in the 2 major scholars on the secularization of American higher education. George Marsden, who was a professor at Notre Dame, wrote many books on this topic. And then James Burchell, who had been the provost of Notre Dame and had been kind of, I'm still not sure why he was pushed out. He was supposed to be the successor to Theodore Hesburgh, but that didn't work out. And he wrote a book called Dying of the Light. And I remember him saying to us at this session, and we were supposed to each bring two church leaders with us. I brought Calvin Rock, who was chairing the Loma Linda board at the time, and Bob Kloosterhuis, who was chairing the Andrews board, as my guests to that all-day session with these 2 authors. And I remember Burchell saying the problem at Notre Dame was that we had angry Catholics who didn't like Catholicism hiring angry Catholics to replace themselves. When they had searches, they were trying to find people just like them. And so that created a problem for them. And so I think what happened was they consciously tried to become more Catholic by having perhaps professors that were more positive about the church institution they were teaching at. And then I was able to recruit John Jenkins, president of Notre Dame, to chair my visit to University of San Diego, an independent Catholic college in San Diego, formed between a women's and a men's college. And if you've been to that campus, it's probably the most beautiful campus of any university in California. And it was interesting for me to watch Father Jenkins probing them on how they were maintaining their Catholic identity. He was doing this in the Joan Kroc Peace Center, which is an unbelievably gorgeous building overlooking the city, Peace Center. But they had in there a Catholic center. And I remember him specifically probing, how are you maintaining your Catholic identity? How are you going about this? And so it was a matter of concern for him as the chair of our visit. I want to go more to governance now, though, Gary, which is really the focus of what we've been talking about here. I liked your chapter. We haven't talked about your emphasis on student participation. And I thought that was a really valuable contribution, that is involving students in all these processes, not just for what they can learn as future leaders, but what they can give to the process, to all the various committees, the academic reviews, and all that kind of a thing. And part of the problem, not just related to student issues, is faculty. You mentioned this, who are willing to participate in governance. More and more faculty are just disgusted, not with board involvement, because to be honest with you, boards are not that involved in governance. I wish they were more interested in academic issues. I'm currently sitting on 6 university boards. I'm on 4 of the board academic affairs committees, and I'm chairing 2 of them. My only board involvement in the church is Loma Linda. The rest is all out of the church. And I wish they would become more interested in how the departments are functioning, not in terms of meddling, but just being concerned about the outcomes and how they're doing. Do they need more resources? And can we restructure and maybe put resources where they're more needed than programs that just continue because they've always been there? I was able to get David Scorton, president of Cornell, to chair my visit to UC Santa Barbara. David was then president of Cornell. He's a medical doctor. After there, he left there, he became head of the Smithsonian, and now he's the head of the medical school colleges in the United States. So he's had an interesting career. And we were with a bunch of faculty and staff, and some of the faculty were getting up and complaining, we don't have enough role in governance, we should be on these committees, and really going on. And finally, one of the faculty members who was on key committees for the university spoke up. He said, I was making that same speech 3 years ago. You don't want to be on these committees. They are a pain in the you-know-what. It's not like I thought it was until I got personally involved. So could you talk maybe a little bit about it seems like a lot of this is internal within the campus, not a board imposed thing or board interference, but it's the way the governance is set up by the campus itself, and perhaps by administration and how they collaborate and work with these various groups. Because it seems like, based on the boards I've been on, and then watching Loma Linda specifically, there's very little board involvement. Now, there are, of course, flashpoints that might come up, as happened at La Sierra in the whole creation evolution thing. And Walla Walla is another example. They had a board chair that was wanting to be overly interfering in the campus. And I remember Al McClure telling me, I want you to be at every Walla Walla board meeting. Don't miss a single one. I was trying to get to the boards at least once a year. And so I made it to all the board meetings when W.G. Nelson and John Brunt were leading that venture. So could you talk a little bit about the challenge of getting faculty participation, the challenge of getting internal structures in place so that there is more collaboration?
Yeah, thanks very much for highlighting the distinction, Dick, between what's going on at the board level and what's going on at the campus level. And I really tried in this chapter, I hope, to underscore that I was interested, and here I was just really echoing that report of the Task Force on University Governance. I really did not want to be focused in this chapter on some kind of conflict between boards and faculties, that this was really about governance below the board level. So I think it's got to be right. It's got to be exactly right that there can be a lot of illusions about what participation looks like and feels like, and there can be tremendous burnout. I remember a point at which, as a faculty member, I think I was sitting on 12 committees, and I had there was a period when I was in England in the fall of 2005, and I used that as an opportunity to get off committees, and I've never been on close to the number that I was on back then. I think it absolutely matters to be aware of those limitations. I think that if we want faculty members involved, recognizing that it is a challenge to make that happen, I guess I would say maybe we want a couple of things. So, of course, first of all, it's got to be important for people to judge that their time is being well spent, in the sense that what they're doing is actually making a difference. If you have the sense that, you put a lot of time into something, but really the outcome would have been the same had you been involved or not, obviously that's an issue. You need to make sure that there's a genuine effectiveness of participation. Probably also, it's got to be important to think carefully at the institutional level about how to divvy up responsibility. I don't think it's a constructive use of anybody's time to get involved in micromanaging. And so we talk about, over involvement, as you rightly note, say, for instance, by a board chair. But I think at the same, you can have the same problem institutionally with an attempt to, at a school level or at the institutional level, to manage things that really ought to be managed, that could be managed more effectively at lower levels. If you try to run too much at too high a level, then it seems to me, again, the workload becomes too high, and faculty members, may find themselves just caught up in a level of time-consuming detail that's just not going to be appealing. So I'd say, number one, if you want faculty members involved, make sure that the involvement's effective. Number two, make sure that it involves a kind of reasonable scope of concern and influence, rather than a kind of obsessive focus on detail. And that, by the way, to be clear, is the kind of thing that faculty members are often responsible for. So I'm not suggesting that that's, administrators just dumping stuff on faculty members. That's really a challenge that I think some faculty members want to be able to tell their colleagues what to do in ways that I'm not sure is very constructive. So those would be my initial instincts in response to what you said. I think it's a genuine problem.
Okay, if I could enter in here, Gary, if you don't mind. I don't know if it's a question I have to ask as much as a comment. And I appreciate what you do, what David does, but I've worked in the church on the other side of this thing, on the financial side, looking at colleges and universities. And I think sometimes faculty are rearranging deck chairs on the ship when there's a major hole in the hull. We're trying to keep the ship of education afloat. I think there's a couple areas here that we need to address. One is the issue of the role of alums in the operation of the school. I came here in 1997, a few years after the Great Divorce here at Loma Linda and La Sierra. And I heard of alums who were really adamant that they were behind the separation. They did not like the idea of losing it. So you've got to keep the alums happy, especially those who donate to you. And secondly, the role of students, which Dick Osborne just commented on, but it's much broader than that. You have to have a program that students will want to come to. And I worked for a small college in upstate New York, a Division III school. And the president was lamenting the fact is that Division III schools cannot run a good athletic program. And as a result of that, they don't get men into the program as well. So I guess I'm just kind of fishing here. But the other part of it was students demand certain grades nowadays. It's not like when I went to school, a C was a C. You worked for it. But students say, hey, I spend 35. I don't know what it costs to go to La Sierra anymore. Is it 40,000 yet a year, or?
It's in that vicinity, but I can't give you an exact number.
Yeah, no, I'm going to say, I spend $40,000 a year, and I'm looking for an A here. And if you don't give me an A, I'm going to go to rate my professor. And, really give you a bad rep. So I'm just wondering, are we, and maybe this is not part of governance, it's another area. I think sometimes that faculty are a little too ivory tower, and they need to take a look at some of the issues that bring the students into the college or not, and what will keep them there. So I may be yammering along here. I think we have to take a look at some practical areas, and just want to know your comment. How does that fit into governance, and so on? Thank you for listening to my rant.
Oh, no, of course. No, I think of course, Forrest. And I tried to say something earlier that I hope tilted in the same direction that you're going, that I think it can be very easy for faculty members who are constitutionally disposed to be dreamers. I think that's part of their jobs, but they're constitutionally disposed to be dreamers. And as a result, I think can be inattentive to the immediate practical concerns for institutional, growth or even institutional survival. So, I think, so this is, well, perhaps it's long enough in the past that I can talk about this without being unnecessarily combative to anybody. This won't be perceived as a volley in some kind of ongoing dispute. But I think we saw this at La Sierra with the dispute over general education in the mid-90s, that you had a bunch of very capable people, including, a couple of people who had been very, very, effective and capable teachers for me, who invested time and energy in formulating, a new general education program for La Sierra that, I think was a challenge for a number of students and led to some enrollment decline. And, that was something that was very unsettling. And then it led to a pretty aggressive intervention on the part of the board. And I wasn't enthusiastic about the way in which the board proceeded. On the other hand, I also wasn't enthusiastic about what I thought were, some of the choices that had been made with respect to that general education curriculum. And I think that clearly was something that, at least over the short term, definitely had consequences for the vitality of the institution. And, the people involved said, well, we always knew that was going to happen. Well, fair enough, but I think that's something that really has to be taken seriously into account. So my view, as I try to say, maybe it's helpful and maybe it's not, but I try to say this in the following chapter, is you don't get good decisions out of people who don't have a certain measure of financial accountability. And so I really think that the institution needs to be structured in a way that ensures that strategic investments and budgeting decisions are made in ways that are much more responsive to the realities of what happens on the ground institutionally. I think right now institutions often operate in ways that shield decision makers, both individuals and entities, from having to bear the consequences of decisions that they make. And I think that needs to be rethought if you want people to make better choices, because you're absolutely right. Students certainly have options. And, I went to school, as I think a number of people in this group did, at a time when it just seemed obvious to most Adventist students that they were going to go to Adventist colleges. And now the people who were the people who are the equivalent of those who were kind of the real stars when I was there at La Sierra in the 80s, very much aware they can go anywhere they want. And they're not, they don't feel limited to La Sierra or other Adventist institutions at all. We're aware that they and other students have many, many options. And, we certainly have to be aware of that and responsive to it. Whether that means we have a great athletic program with all the costs involved in that is of course a real challenge. I certainly hope it doesn't mean we just give everybody A's. I mean, I think there was probably something to be said for the following arrangement when I was a law student, that for the large for all the first year classes and for the large second and third year classes, there was a mandatory grade distribution. And so it wasn't a matter of, something that was up to the instructor. You had to hand in grades that fell within that distributional pattern. At least that protected the instructor to some extent from being pressured to make bad choices there. Whether we need to do that, I don't know. But I think that the individual student benefits from getting an A only if everybody else doesn't get an A. There's a certain kind of internal contradiction because the individual student looks good with an A if there are people who are not getting A's and that student stands out. If everybody gets an A, employers and graduate schools are aware that the A doesn't mean very much and they start to look for other ways of differentiating. So if we want to be helpful to students as a group, and if we want to be honest to graduate schools and employers, I think we have to hold the line on grades. That wasn't the main point of your observation, but I just am struck by that again.
Well, I appreciate your response, and I just, I remember at the beginning of the school year, we get a budget and it had all this registrations. This is what we're going to make, and then by December, we had a lot of receivables, not a lot of cash, and so it just through the whole year we got receivables kept building up and up and up, and so it becomes a big strain if you don't deal with that. So I'm going to let Dick Osborne has his hand up, and I'm going to turn back to you, Dick.
Yeah, the general studies program at La Sierra. I remember John Brunt, who was the academic dean at Walla Walla, who's a loyal La Sierra alum, saying we loved the general studies program there because we got so many students.
I remember that. Yeah.
And then I had another friend of mine who, has a PhD from Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and eventually became an academic dean. He said it was a program designed by academics that they would have enjoyed taking when they were students, but they weren't the typical student. How do you get faculty to be less resistant to change? Higher ed is perhaps the institution that's the most resistant to change. And a couple of anecdotes. I remember when Bill Lovelace was president of Columbia Union College, he started the adult evening program over the objections of the faculty. And yet it saved the college because of the income it brought and the mission extended. And I saw this same thing happen when I was at WASC with Merrill Ewert, who was president of Fresno Pacific University, a Mennonite college in the Valley. He, over the objections of the faculty, created adult centers all through the Valley. And not only in Fresno, but Bakersfield and Hanford and many of these cities, and really served especially a Hispanic population, many women who were unable to get access to education, who could take evening classes and advance their careers. And the faculty hated Merrill for that. And yet it saved them because he knew that they could not rely on traditional students in dormitories in Fresno for the future. He could just see that coming. And it provided them the income to allow the traditional campus to continue to exist. But even when he retired, they were still complaining about this decision. Now we have something at Loma Linda that's coming about that was announced this week, and it's called the Pivot. Ron Carter presented the Pivot. The goal is to have 5,000 traditional students on campus. They're at 4,600 now, to have 5,000 online students for a total of 10,000 students. The idea is to create a larger number and a higher quality online programs that can be taken anywhere in the world in the fields of medical sciences. And it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out, because again, that's a pretty dramatic change from the face-to-face emphasis of Loma Linda. So how do you suggest breaking down the resistance of traditional faculty to new ideas? You work for a dean who's one of the most innovative leaders I've ever been around, Johnny Thomas. And he seems to have been able to do a lot of that kind of innovative thinking, but it's not typical for most traditional faculty members.
You're absolutely right. And, when I think about the kinds of, possibilities that you've talked about, Dick, my first thought is, when I look at what's happened in, say, in the area, I think results talk very loudly. I look at the way in which, Chapman University in the 90s, in the 80s, went to the trouble of creating a whole very elaborate off-campus program, which might well have met, I suspect it did meet, with resistance on the part of on-campus faculty members. And of course, what happened as a result was that program thrived sufficiently that it was able to dramatically change, it seems to me, the dynamics on campus, enough so that it, of course, continues to exist now under a name that's separate from Chapman to contribute to Chapman's financial health. Meanwhile, Chapman has leaped up, it seems to me, a cluster of rungs on the higher educational ladder because of what it was able to do with the resources that program generated. I think a faculty member who's willing to look at the long term and see how, a traditional program can in fact be dramatically enhanced by doing some things that may look very non-standard, will, I hope, be inspired by that and excited by it. Now, the devil's in the details, and obviously people have specific circumstances and concerns that they may bring to the table. But, are there faculty members who are simply unresponsive to evidence of positive results? Yeah, I suppose that's true, and I'm not sure what you can do about that. But to the extent that you make changes that really have bottom line positive impacts on people's ability to do the things that most engage them as faculty members, then I think the sensible ones will be along for the ride. Obviously, some may not be.
And just to follow up, Branson University is the institution that was created out of Chapman. And on Friday, it was finally publicly announced that the University of Massachusetts is actually taking them over, the Branson University, for a big sum of money. And it'll even broaden its reach beyond California through the UMass connection.
Fascinating. And at the same time, if, given this large sum, it's contributing presumably in a pretty substantial way to Chapman's efforts. So that's a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, I have Robert Ford. Bob?
Yes, Gary.
Yes, sir.
How would you see Adventist higher education in North America, and this could even be worldwide, create collaborative governance structures that reach across the narrow constituencies that tend to be union-based and alumni-based? And so that we are, I think, unwilling to maybe look at some big changes, whether it be online education or consolidation of governance across North America, so that we would limit investments in certain areas. Maybe some colleges will become art schools and other schools will become music, others become medicine, and to get some market realities in that really push the envelope, because higher education is going through major revolutionary change right now. And do we have a structure of governance across North America that could actually deal with it?
So I agree 100% with the premise that higher education is undergoing substantial changes. I also agree 100% that we've got to find ways to ensure that institutions take account of the market realities you mentioned. I'm nervous about moving toward some kind of greater institutional coordination for two reasons. The first is that, as we've seen, especially in recent years, the central church leadership that we can reasonably expect be involved in this kind of activity, I think could be expected to use that kind of coordination to try to impose ideological uniformity. in one way or another. I would be really nervous about the ways in which I think that kind of thing could happen. We've already seen that with the ongoing attempts, for instance, to regulate and accredit religion programs via the ministerial training, oversight bodies at the North American Division of the General Conference. And I think you'd see an extension of that kind of thing if there were more institutional integration. The other thing, I guess, is that it seems to me there's a real need for experimentation. I think we learn best by experimenting, and an overall system is going to be more, it seems to me, anti-fragile, more resilient if that experimentation doesn't happen in a uniform across the board way, but happens at lower levels, happens institutionally. And I think that kind of experimentation, therefore, is going to be more likely when individual institutions have the latitude to try new things out and then can benefit from those choices, but also have to bear responsibility for making bad choices. And undoubtedly, that's going to mean that some institutions pass off the map. Others take their place, and maybe there will be some consolidation that happens, just as a matter of, just the developed response to these market realities. I know someone who, has quipped only half seriously that what we really need is to close La Sierra and PUC and relocate a new institution on the campus of Monterey Bay Academy. Whether that's intended seriously or not, undoubtedly there are real shifts that I think need to happen. But I think we're just better off as a general matter if those happen as a result of experimentation at the local level, I think, rather than an attempt to try out one-size-fits-all solutions. My instinct.
Well, it's a good point, and I appreciate that. Could you comment on the broader global education of Adventist education? Do you think there are some things from what you've written that would help us to allow more experimentation globally and then have interaction between our, I was at the Adventist University of Central Africa that now has almost 8,000 students.
Awesome.
And it's the premier private education in the country of Rwanda today, if not much of Central Africa. How much influence, or should there be more interaction between our SDA schools in America and around the world? And we could maybe create a product of higher education that is more in tune with the nature of the world today and how fast things change.
So I'd love to see North American institutions learn from the most successful Adventist institutions elsewhere. And certainly there are some that are that have grown and thrived in remarkable ways. I think the experience of Adventists in Africa points to that, because the Adventist University of Central Africa is not, I think, the only place where that kind of growth is evident. Of course, one challenge there is that I think a number of the institutions in Africa, and I think the same is true of Samyuk in Korea, have been very open to welcoming non-Adventist students in a way that, I think some North American institutions have been less comfortable doing. I think, beyond that, I don't know enough about the experience of those other institutions. It sounds to me like you have much more recent and focused experience, and not more recent. It would imply that I had some experience. You have experience and I don't, Bob. So at the 40,000 foot level, I agree 100% that we can learn from those experiences about how to perhaps try out possibilities that, church leaders elsewhere have been more open to, that some here have been uncomfortable with. I'd love to see more experimentation happen, guided by that experience. But specifically what paths we ought to be taking, I think you know more than I do.
Well, thank you. It's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Gary, thank you very much for your presentation today. I'm going to turn this over to David now. David, you can conclude.
Thank you, everybody. I very much appreciate what you've said and done. Thank you to Gary. Thank you to all of you who have participated. We've had a lot of expertise in this conversation, and we can be very grateful for that. I really took notice of Dick Osborne's suggestion that this book needs to be more widely available to administrators in education and in the church across the world. And if there is anybody who has the resources to help that happen, be sure to let one of us know. Different projects appeal to different people. And if helping to make this book more widely available appeals to you, then let's talk further. Now, I will turn off Facebook and YouTube, and you folk can continue talking informally about anything that you want. But this is the end of our formal conversation, and this is also the time when we release Gary to get on to the next appointment of his day. So here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
So the next time Dr. Chartier is around, I hope Dr. Osborne